Cider Chat is where cider fans and brands connect with the who's who in cider. Find out more at ciderchat.com. I'd like to welcome Dan Gallagher of Frosty Twig. He's based in Canton, New York. I had the opportunity to meet you, Dan, at the New York Apple Camp, which took place in 2023. And more recently, you sent me some info on some of your record keeping and everything you're doing out there. So, got a lot going on. I want to bring listeners up to date on who you are in that welcome to the program here and tell us a little bit about your journey to cider making and where you're going with that. So, let's begin there.
Okay. I've been making cider since about 2017, which is when I bought the property where I currently am that has maybe 70 or 80 old. And when I started looking at the apples on the trees that first fall, I was like, I'm not really sure what these would be good for. And I thought maybe a hard cider would be something to try and use them for. And so even that first winter, trying to pick some that were already, frozen on the tree there and try and use those. And then really I think that second fall in 2018, really delving into trying ferment it into hard cider.
Did you have a passion for, and you were saying hard cider, I just call it cider. Did you have a passion for cider prior to this? Was this something that you were pretty familiar with?
Definitely with apples, yes. I'm from Central Virginia originally and grew up Central Appalachia, foraging a lot in the summer for berries. We had quince tree actually in the front yard growing up, apples, blackberries, pears, everything's nearby. And when I was in high school, actually, I worked at a really large apple and peach orchard in Central Virginia. So I think the apple part of it goes back a long way, but not so much the hard cider part and the cider part.
So the actual making of the cider was something that you've gotten your skills more recently?
Yes,
Then.
absolutely.
Okay. And is that book study or hanging out with people or taking courses? How'd that come about?
I definitely self-taught and definitely reading a lot of books. I didn't find a lot of the information I found online particularly helpful. I think, and we can chat about that as we look at the record keeping. I think there's a lot of conflicting information or people that are very passionate that cider has to be made one way versus another way. And so I think looking through a lot of those different styles and ways of making cider, I was like, how can I teach myself? Not really having a mentor about going into this. And certainly I think the books helped a lot, but I think just trying things and seeing how they turned out and tasting them and saying that worked or that didn't work was really, I think, that early first 2 or 3 years.
I want to get into that point about different voices coming in. Why don't you say a little bit more about that?
I think when you look through a lot of the social media, you'll see these short snippets of things or read blogs or see posts. And a lot of times I see maybe a homemaker or a hobby maker post a question about a particular style or, hey, this is my first time doing this. And then you'll see 30 or 40 different answers because it is an art and it is a science. And I think while there are certain things you want to not do or do, there's also not one right answer. So I think when you're just starting out and you see a lot of conflicting data, and maybe you're not sure about what direction you want to go in or what's the best method or how long to age something, or also a lot of questions on people looking at the visually right through the carboy wall. Is this normal? Is that normal? Is this normal? Is it foaming too much? Is it not foaming enough? With any fermentation, it's seems daunting. And then once you delve into it, you're like, oh, it's really not that much. As long as you avoid a couple key things, it's going to do its own thing and you learn the more you do it. A lot of it also, whether it was 500 years ago or now, is looking around in your environment and seeing what's available to add into a cider or do a co-ferment or anything like that. Especially, let's say there's like an early variety apple that's not particularly interesting. I know a lot of makers out there shy away from those early ripening varieties of apples. But I've noticed there's so much in the environment that's ripe around that time, late summer, early fall, from blackberries to elderberries, chokecherries, aronia, all these things that can add a lot of depth and flavor and tannins and everything into your cider as well. And I think probably our ancestors were doing the same thing, right? If they throw fruit in and see what happens.
Yeah, definitely. You reached out to me and you showed me a cider log. And I'm going to bring that up on the screen now because I thought this was interesting. And just for listeners who aren't seeing this visually, and we'll have this on the show notes for Dan's episode, but I do know that I'm going to be posting up on the screen. First, the one that he actually filled in a form here. It's called Frosty Twig Cider Log. Your record keeping here. What are you looking for when you are making I'm going to call it a batch of cider?
When I made this document, I tried to put everything I might use on there, even though every batch was going to be a little different. So whether it's a single varietal or you're doing a blend at the beginning, you're doing a blend at the end, you're doing a co-ferment, you're doing a wild fermentation, you're doing a pitched cultured yeast, to try and allow for space to write all of that down so that I had the most amount of flexibility, knowing I might just put an X or leave it blank. I'd rather remind myself in the moment as I'm making a batch, thinking about each of these steps as I go along. Because I think once we're like in the cellar and in the moment and you've got the open carboy or you've got the star san open, then you don't want to be running around trying to find the things. So sometimes looking at ahead of time, just making myself a sort of a mental checklist of what do I need? Do I have everything in place? Do I have the equipment? Do I have the siphon hoses and all that stuff? And I tried to leave
You don't have that checklist here. That's like another checklist to have, isn't it? What equipment to need at that specific time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I tried to leave the most. I read through this and I can jog my memory, but I think adding a second page, maybe any kind of cheat sheet. I'm a big fan of those things that you jog your memory or remind yourself in the moment where you're at.
Because this is a visual and we're doing audio and a little visual. Let's start at the top line. So you have batch and you wrote 16W and there's a space to write, like, I guess the batch number, what you're calling it. So what are you talking about when you say 16W?
So normally I just start at 1 with my numbering and just go as however many batches I have. And then usually with the lettering, it might be some sort of mental jog about what it is. With the W in this particular case, it was a wild ferment, but it might be B for berry or whatever else we're doing.
All right. Yeah. So you have to have your own kind of categorizing. You have to be a good file keeper for sure. And then right next to the top, it says batch size. So it says you wrote in 5 there. So I'm thinking that's 5 gallons.
Yeah, a 5-gallon carboy there.
It says press date. So that's a press date, which could be different from the pitch date of the yeast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a carboy date as well, because one of the things I started playing with this year was actually doing some maceration as well. So the press date when you actually press your pomace might be different than when you actually move it into your vessel.
Okay, so in this case, it says 10/9/22. So we're looking at October 9th, 2022. And then there's two columns. So I believe we probably would start on the left column and let's talk about that first box there. What do you call in that first box? Variables and ratios.
Yeah, I have different any apple
Good.
variety that you might use. So if it's a single, you could write in golden russet. Sometimes I'll put in different ratios, pretty vague. You can be as specific or as loose as you want to there. So it might be 1/3 Cortland, 2/3 wild crab apple. And then I have a place there for the recording the pH as well.
So on this case, it says FT plus forge, mix, and wild. So what's your script there? What's FT mean?
That would be Frosty Twig.
Frosty Twig. Okay.
Yeah. As I mentioned, I have planted a lot of apple trees here on the Frosty Twig, but many of those are not producing just yet. So if I started in 2017, 2018, hopefully we'll start to see some of that fruit coming in shortly. But I do have 70, 80 wild apple trees to pull from. So anytime I have that Frosty FT or Frosty Twig, that would be stuff I picked from on the farm. And then forage is usually within a mile or two of the farm, just driving the country roads, finding those hedgerow trees. So you can add as little or as much data there as you want.
Yeah, I like it. And we're going to peel away what you're doing with this particular cider. And it also says wild. So yeah, that's the way Dan's setting it up. Whatever kind of fits your scenario, right? If you're sourcing it from a particular orchard, it's probably a good idea to write down what the name of that orchard is so that you can follow up if it worked well, or maybe there were some nutrients or the pH was different from one orchard to the other. And in this case, this batch called 16W had a pH of 0.2.
Maybe on the lower end of what I'd like to see, but in that butter zone.
Yeah, no doubt. So then we go down the list here, and now you have the carboy date below that one, and it's the same date as the pressing. So you put it directly into the carboy, I'm assuming. See, I wasn't even there, and I could read your script and know exactly what you're doing, which is a nice thing too. And in that same box, you have Camden tab. So that is the metabisulfite that one might or might not add. And in this case, you wrote what I could see is no, you didn't add anything. Is that typical for you? I'm just curious about your cider making style there.
Not necessarily. I think this year I actually, and by this year 2022, the year that I did this, I did a batch where I said, hey, let me start with 40, 50 gallons in a big barrel so that it's all one type of juice, and remove every variable except the yeast. So maybe I tried, I think it would be 9 or 10 carboys. So take that juice, put it into 9 separate carboys. So all of those variables are the same. And then try my control in this particular case would be that wild ferment, and then eight different pitched yeasts, and just focus only on that. So try and see what happens and how the yeast affects the flavor, the fermentation, and all of those things. I do a fair amount of wild fermentation, but I wouldn't say it's certainly the only thing.
Yeah. Not everybody has the luxury of just doing one specific way with the apples that they're sourcing, whether it's from their own property or beyond. So that's pretty classic there. All right, we're going to keep on going down this list here. The next box, and I'm pulling up my phone because it's a little far away from the screen here so I can see what you have there, but you have the pitch date and the temperature in that box. Any reason why you put pitch date and temperature? And this is for beginners to know this. What's the reasoning behind that?
I think if you're adding those sulfites early in the process, you definitely want to wait at least a day or two before you pitch your yeast in there. So that's, again, just a check that if I were putting those sulfites in to kill any wild yeast, that I have waited a day or two. And I don't always remember what date I put it in and what day I'm in pitching yeast. That's why I have that on there.
Yeah, that's a really good point there. You don't want to pitch if you're using a cultured yeast right after you put in metabisulfite. And so the temperature here, what he put in the box was wild for the pitch state. So that's a wild yeast, and the temperature was 65 degrees, which is warm, but yeast want warm to start munching away on all the tasty apple sugars. So cool, good box there. The next box down below is you have two things in here. Again, it's tasting notes and look. So that's the visual there. And the tasting notes, I love how you wrote this. It says appley good. And then in the look section, you wrote in blue carboy. Oh no.
I do have one carboy that has blue glass, but it's a light enough blue that often I get a little panicky when I don't remember, because it makes the cider looks an odd off color. So I try and note that when I use that one.
Well, that must be like an artifact, like blue. I have a greenish tint to one of my carboys, which is, I know it's old, and that one, like, I wonder what that was used for, medicinal or something way back when, right? Probably. Who knows? All right. So now we go down, and here's some like very critical things. In the next box, it says soft SG, which is soft SG stands for specific gravity. And then it also has sugar type. So what do you mean by soft specific gravity there? And the specific gravity is a ratio of sugar to solution. I'm going to just say it like that. That's the easiest way to make it for beginners. And just for the total Apple science folks, he has here 1.050, and he put no for sugar. But let's just talk, why are you calling it soft specific gravity?
I think it's just to differentiate between a soft and hard, which was originally my sort of thinking about it, but it's essentially your starting gravity.
Starting gravity. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. I'd never heard it called soft, but I like that. It's like leaning into the cider. And no sugar was added, but this would be where you put if you're adding any kind of sugar.
Mhm.
You have post specific gravity and you have an X underneath that, and then sugar added. Again, I think that is saying no, but I'm not sure. I can't read your script there. Is that
No,
okay?
yep.
So post, is that looking for final gravity there, or
Right, that
is
would
it?
just be if no, just if you added some additional sugar to bring your level of that starting specific gravity up, then I would take the starting gravity of just the sweet cider, soft cider, starting without any additions first, and then measure it again with the hydrometer if I've added additional sugar and write that number down as well.
Okay, perfect. Okay, and so just for listeners out there in Ciderville, we're geeking out here a little bit, so just follow us along. Again, maybe your best bet is to open up the show notes for this here episode with Dan Gallagher of Frosty Twig, or go, perhaps it might be up on YouTube and you could watch it there in real time, pre-recorded real time at least, to see what we're talking about. But these are really critical things for cider making. A lot of people think, oh, you make cider, you just throw in a jug and voila, which is what I do. But if you want to follow your path, you do want to take records. It's like marking the mark on how you grow over the years. And then as you get to a certain point in life, you start marking how you start shrinking over the years. I haven't shrunk yet. Okay. All right. Going further, the next box has acid blend and pectin enzyme. So here you put in 1 teaspoon and then of the acid blend, and the pectic enzyme you have, it looks like 2.5 teaspoons.
Mhm.
So these again, not everybody adds anything. Some people do. This is Dan's choice to do that, but this is where you would want to know your measurement. You want to say more about that?
I think a few of these things I've since stopped using. I'm like exploring the less input method. But I think, again, this is probably earlier on. I think as you do these things and you read again advice online about, oh, if you're using store bought juice or you're not sure about the source of particular things, you should add some of these things in to cover your bases. And certainly, I think if on this batch, I probably would leave a few of these things off, especially that acid blend here. If we've already got a pH of 3.2,
Mhm.
we probably don't need that in there. So
Yeah, yeah. You're so right. When I first started making cider, oh, you got to add that pectic enzyme. You got to do that. You got to measure and that, and especially when you're doing like wild ferment. And I think this will resonate with a lot of makers out there who know the orchard. They've been doing it for a while. You have a general sense. You don't do a lot of this. You just let it go. But certainly, I think it's always good to start from ground zero and build up your skills, get your confidence. Obviously, this was made in 2022. We're in 2024 recording. So your learning curve has really shot up in a very short amount of time. Have you tasted this cider? Is it bottled and are you happy with it?
yes and yes.
Hey.
I think with any of them, I think one of the reasons why I like to do this is really I do flip back. I have a binder for every year, so I do hole punch these and keep them so that I can look back. I think especially because often if we're waiting 6, 9 months, maybe a year or more between when we made it and when we're tasting it, we might not, at least I don't, always remember what I did. So I find some of these things really helpful and say something turned out really great. What do I think that maybe is? And if I've done a compare and contrast where I've had two batches that are very similar with only one difference, that might be an indicator versus maybe one of those times where something isn't so right. Either it goes bad or there's just an off tasting note or it's too sharp or whatever the case might be. You again can look back and make those small corrections. So hopefully every batch is getting a little better and you like it more as you go.
Yeah, absolutely. The next box has yeast nutrient and yeast, and it looks like you put 5 maybe teaspoons in there. Is that T for
Mhm.
teaspoons? Now, yeast nutrient is, again, something you got to put that in, especially as a beginning cider maker. And you're looking at all these things you need to buy. You thought you just could get juice, and now you got to get pectin enzyme, master blend, and yeast nutrient and all that. How often do you add yeast nutrient now? Is
I
that
probably about half the time. And I think some of it might also go to the variety, how late into the year those varieties are. Probably if I'm adding 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or more different types of apples, I'm probably less likely to add that in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can't remember the last time I added yeast nutrient to any of my ciders. I don't know. It just doesn't cross my mind anymore to do that. And of course, I'm not going commercial, so that's a totally different ball game. I'm doing primarily wild ferment and getting sourcing from the same place. So that goes back to
Mhm.
that original statement. But this is something to consider. So the last box on the left side says ferment description, and you have 1016 starting. So let's explain to listeners what you mean by that. Remember, he presses on October 9th.
Mhm. So usually I try and put a date. I've since started like adding other dates as I go, try and take a visual at a couple points during that primary fermentation, just again to get a visual how fast it's starting, is it super active, has it coming up through the airlock, and that will also help me adjust headspace for that primary and take the temperature and take the literal temperature and see how that is affecting that ferment, whether it's cooler or warmer. And you can also look across all your carboys if you started them at a similar time and see where everything is and how fast the yeast is producing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good idea. So there will be an updated form on the show notes for this episode because Dan has already tweaked it and we don't have that one here. So this is again from 2022. So now we're going to go to the top of the right side of this script here. And he has in that box first, he has three boxes in a row. The first box says first rack date and temperature, and then it goes second rack date and temperature, and then third rack date and temperature. Dan, how about if we explain to folks out in Ciderville what you mean by rack first, just for the total like non cider makers out there?
Sure. Essentially, after primary fermentation is ending, usually I'll siphon the cider from one vessel to another, obviously from the vessel that it's in to a clean, sanitized vessel, normally leaving the lees at the bottom. So you move it into secondary fermentation there.
And the lees are the dead yeast cells, and I also happen to call it schmutz sometimes, a little bit of schmutz on the bottom. You want to get it off. It's like a little thick layer of and it's called the lees, of course. Now, in the first rack date, so you press this, it started fermenting on 10/16, October 16th, and you racked it over on December 13th. So that's right on. And that's somebody who tells, I look at that and I go, oh man, this guy's paying attention to his cider versus me. I'm in January. Say,
Mm,
I'm going away for 2 months. I better rack over my cider now. But
yeah.
is that like your kind of pattern? Are you finding like a 2 month period or?
Mm. Yes, but I think it also has to do just with life. So I'm also an educator. So often I find that my cider schedule somewhat corresponds to the academic calendar as well. So if I have a winter break, that's when I have a month off, and that's when I can do a lot of work on this. And then you'll probably see as we talk about our second and third here, usually if there's a spring break in there and I have time, I'll try and fit it in. Otherwise, it'll have to be in after the semester is over and I have time to actually get to it.
I see that there's no second rack date. There's nothing in there. That's totally empty. And then we go third rack date. It's in June now, June
Mm-hmm.
10th, 2023.
Mm-hmm.
So did you find it really totally cleared out by then? Because in the next box, you have bottle date, and that was the same day you racked it and bottled it the same day. It must have been totally clarified or to the
Mm-hmm.
point that you liked it.
Yeah, yeah. Usually, I probably did do a second rack date, but I'm always not the best, even myself, the best record keeper. So it probably happened. Otherwise, I would have put the third under the second there. But yeah, I definitely try and rack right before bottling as well. Just if there's anything at the bottom there, I don't want to accidentally stir up in the bottling process.
Yeah, yeah. And so I'm going to dig into this a little bit more. So, as Dan mentioned, you're siphoning it over from one vessel to another and taking it off the lees. And each time you rack it, this is a way to keep on clarifying your solution more and more. And as you get further towards, that mark, if you started in October, now you're looking at June, and you did a couple rackings, and I might, like yourself, do 3 rackings over the course of that time, you're going to find less and less lees on the bottom, and that clarifies it. And a commercial maker might just put it through a filter and just filter it out. And what you're trying to do there is have clarity and also bottle stability when you're doing commercial. Not all commercial makers do that, of course, but many do. In this case, this is a 5-gallon batch, so it's really easy to rack it over in that way. You have bottle date on June 10th, 2023. And at that point, I believe now you're taking the specific gravity at that point of bottling. That's the next box down. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about that, about the specific gravity. What are we looking for when we are bottling at that point?
It depends on if you want something that's more with a little residual sweetness. If you're doing a pet nat, if you're going totally dry, you could get that level. And that will also tell you what your ABV, you can compare the starting gravity to the ending gravity there and get your ABV level.
So I'm going to call it the original gravity, and he had it here as soft gravity. That was 1.050, and the end gravity he has here as 1. So it's 1.000. And at that point, you're pretty much guaranteed that it's fermented out at 1.000, and you're not going to have to worry about the cider re-fermenting in the bottle. I like doing pet nat, so I won't necessarily go down to 1.00. I might bottle a little bit earlier, but at that stage, you're pretty much A-okay. And we do have episodes on watching out for what is called bottle explosions. I'm not going to use that word. It's spelled B-O-M-B. It's dangerous. You have to we laugh about it. It is funny to think about in one way. I remember my parents making root beer and having that down the root cellar kind of going. Glass breaking out of high pressure is really dangerous. So that's what we're talking about, specific gravity. We have episodes talking about that if you want to dig in deeper. The other thing that you have in this box here is ABV, which stands for, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Alcohol by volume. So again, you can use your starting gravity and your ending gravity to figure out how much alcohol is actually in that particular bottle.
And in this case, what did you have here?
I had about 6%, which usually I think between 6 and 8 is where I usually find that my batches end up.
Yeah, wonderful. And also in that box, you have a little spot where you could put flavoring if there was any flavoring added. So what, for non-cider makers, what do you mean by flavoring? What would be added there classically?
It could be any sort of fruit juice. I've seen people add any kind of like apple flavoring if they were going to do that, ginger, spices, aromatics, herbal additions, really anything that you wanted to add there as you got right before bottling.
But there was none added to this batch. So the next box, you have sugar and also fake sugar in that. So tell us what you're talking about there, the difference between sugar and fake sugar. I like
if you're doing any kind of priming, so in this particular case, this would have been a still cider, but I wanted a little bubble in there, giving something for that yeast to wake back up and make a little carbonation. So you could use a lot of different things there. In this particular case, I added a half cup of dextrose to the entire carboy, stirred it in so that when I bottled it again, that added a little bit of carbonation there. I think I've changed the fake sugar to like any kind of back sweetening, really, which could be any number of things in there as well. But you could use any kind of non-sugar or sugar additive or anything like that if you wanted to add sweetness in there. Again, I tried to make as many columns as possible for the most amount of use there.
Yeah, I could think of so many times I've been making cider. At the end, I'm like, oh, let me throw in this or let me try that. And I think about it How much sugar did I add? If I added that, as you're saying, and having that marked down is really important because what do your friends ask you when you bring a bottle of cider to share? What apples? What did you add? And you're able to say, "I'll just bring it up here on my phone, and I have it exactly." That would be a beautiful thing. I'm always like,
Mhm.
I can't remember. I can't remember. It's wild. It's all wild is what I tell everybody. The next box says tasting notes, and we go back to that descriptor called look. And so let's talk about what do you have in the box there?
So for under my tasting notes, I at least at this point thought it was pretty delicious and appley, which is good because sometimes when you get those drier ciders, you're not getting some of that real fruity flavor coming through. And then yeah, just some sort of visual descriptor as to the color, if it's a straw or a darker amber or a golden color as well. In this particular case, I believe I use a brown bottle. So once it goes into that bottle, I no longer have that ability to really see what it looks like.
Well, we do know that the longer cider sits around for a while, the darker it typically gets in colors. Even if it goes in a brown bottle, you're able to go back to your notes, and if you pour that in or into a glass like 5 years later, and
Mhm.
it's a very dark amber, and originally it was like, as you have here, a pale golden, you might be looking at maybe some oxidation
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
just an aged cider, and the whole profile is going to be changed at that point, certainly to a certain degree. What about aroma? Did you have anything for aroma or the bouquet? It's not on here I see, but,
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
that something that you've added to the new script?
It isn't, but it probably should be. I think perhaps if I didn't add it in, or I've written in under tasting notes, maybe something like that. But then that's a great thing, I think, to possibly add a new column there. I think I always get a little nervous when I have something open. I'm always trying
Oh,
to limit the amount of time I'm introducing oxygen in to the
yeah.
scenarios.
Yeah, I don't know about you, buddy, but when I'm racking over cider or I'm bottling, the first thing I do is I always pour myself a glass. I start there while I'm bottling and dipping and all that, so there's always a little bit of extra am I the only one that's doing that? You do that too, right?
I'll usually go and get one from last year. So I have a cold carbonated cider to join while I rack over a bottle.
All right, okay, I guess I'm maybe unique in that way. I don't think so. I think there's other folks who are, like, racking over and drinking it while they're going.
Yeah.
Oh, the times I could recall doing that. All right, let's keep on going down this list here. This is a great one. I really like this. It says bottle yield, and you put down 51. So I'm assuming those are 12-ounce bottles? Yeah, out
Yeah,
of a
yeah.
5-gallon carboy. That's, and that would probably be a good thing to put in there. Bottle yield, 51 bottles, 12 ounce for size, right? And the
Absolutely. Yeah, if you're using a 750 or whatever size bottle you're using there, or yeah, it would be good.
yeah. Yeah, because a lot of us have a couple different size carboys. So I have a 6.5, and I even have a 5.5, like weird size.
Mhm,
They're
mhm.
not all they look the same sometimes, but they're not the same. So especially for us like home cider makers, that really comes in handy. And label name, there's nothing on a label name. What do you mean by that?
So if you had a name that would go on the label, farmhouse blend or scrumpy or whatever fun name you wanted to add to your label there, at that point, I think the batch and the label are now separate things. So that would allow you to just track across. If you have a particular label, you can match it back to that batch number and match that record out. Whereas so far as getting the commercial license, it's in process for this coming fall. So I'm really excited about that. But up until this point, usually what I ended up doing was just making a blank label that says Frosty Twig Cider. It has a blank space for the ABV and then a big open blank space in the middle where I could write the batch number on there. I found as I was doing some of these tests and trials, I didn't want to think of a separate name for maybe 30 or 40 different things about, oh, let me give this one a clever name and what should the graphics be? I just said, let me make one label for all of them. And that way I'm not bummed out if something doesn't turn out or it's not my favorite or yeah.
Yeah, that's really smart of you. Cool. And the last box on this page here, at least this page says
Mhm.
carbonation and notes, and this it's blank. So what would normally go in there under carbonation?
So I've since moved all of this into a separate database, and then I'll try and give myself maybe 3 or 4 different tasting dates. So maybe taste it 2 weeks out from bottling a month out from bottling, 2 or 3 months out from bottling, and just see how it's progressing, how it's aging in the bottle, what level of carbonation is there. Are there any off flavors? Are there other notes that are coming through that I particularly like? So again, if you wanted to add them here, you certainly could. I've since moved them off, so I have a little bit more room to
Mm,
write in all that information as I go.
yeah. I wish somebody had offered up something like this to me when I first started making cider, because I go back into my notes, and my notes go back many years, and it's really basic. It's just where I got the juice from or the apples, the specific gravity, sulfite or no sulfite, and the yeast. I didn't write down temperature. I didn't write pH. I didn't do any of that stuff. And then I'll just put in like a rack date. But I think the temperature, all that is like really critical because it can so shift depending on where you are making your cider. If you're in an apartment, or if you have a cellar, or if you have a heated cellar, or your life changes and it gets moving. If I had this, I think it would have brought me like up leveled my cider making a lot quicker.
Mm.
And that is something I miss. So I really love that you did this here. What have you added to the sheet that we're missing? Is there, and I'm gonna bring up a clean sheet here,
Okay.
this one
Mhm.
here, and
I
anything in here?
I don't think I added so much as I just tried to clarify some of the terminology because again, maybe I've just learned a little bit more or tried to make it clearer so that if other users out there wanted to use it, it would be a little easier to read and just try and think about what might someone else use if they were interested in doing it. And I do find as I'm self-taught and trying to learn and teach myself, I think this was particularly helpful as a way to really look at because there are so many variables that go in to making cider about doing a trial and just testing